I went home to visit. Home means Boonville, Kentucky. Don't look for it on the map. It's about as big as a postage stamp. At the general store in Boonville, John Moss has been in charge of that store since before I was born. And my grandpa, the preacher, would go in there all the time and try to get John to come to church. But he never had a bit of luck with it at all. John couldn't stand the idea of religion. But my grandpa was not a man to give up. And he went again and again and again, inviting John to come to church, and eventually, nobody knows how it happened, but John went to church, and he got religion. Like some people, he got a real bad case of it. And after that, any time you would go in the general store, when you would buy something, as you were leaving, he would say a Bible verse. I wanted to see that. You don't see that in Texas very often, certainly not in the places where I shop. So I got my radio on and I went up to the general store and I was just hanging out. I bought a moon pie and an RC Coca-Cola. I was just biding the time. And a little boy came in and he bought up a big poke of candy. And just as he headed out, John said, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Rejoice and be glad in it, child." Everybody sitting around the stove said, "Yeah, John, that's right." Because you know, if you've seen something twice, it's not strange anymore. It's true. It's true. It accounts for a whole lot of stuff, doesn't it? The next person that came in was my mother's friend, Betty Ann Sneed, and she said it was getting ready to be her daddy's birthday. And did John have such a thing as a billfold he could sell her? Well, you know how those old general stores are. He had most everything. Finding it, now that's the issue. But he groused around a little bit, and finally he pulled out a real nice looking black calfskin billfold with even had a zipper in it. Sold it to her, and she headed out the door, but just as she was leaving, he said, "Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land that the Lord thy God giveth thee." And even I said, "John, that's right." Because I'd seen it twice, it wasn't straight. A little bit later, the awfulest rig you ever saw in your life pulled up right in front of the store. It was the biggest horse trailer I'd ever laid my eyes on. A man got out. Nobody was surprised that he was a stranger, because nobody that lived around there could afford to buy anything that looked like that. And he came right in, and he proved he was a stranger because he told John right off what it was he wanted. And you know only a stranger would do that. He said, "I'm taking my horse over the mountain to Hazard to the horse show. And it's getting cold outside. And I've got a bound to have a horse blanket for my horse. Have you got a horse blanket you could sell me?" John said he thought he did. Like I told you, finding it, that's the rub. He scrabbled around, and finally he pulled out a horse blanket. A very nice horse blanket. He laid it on the counter before the fellow, and he said, "Now this is a real good blanket, and it'll keep your horse good and warm, and it's only $27.95. $27.95, said the stranger. $27.95? Do you know what's outside your door? John said, "A horse trailer." I said, "A $65,000 horse trailer, that's what you see. Do you really think I'm going to buy any little old cheap, sleazy $27.95 horse blanket to go on a horse that rides in an $85,000 horse trailer?" John said, "I guess not." He said, "Have you got a better one?" John scooped up that one that was on the counter. He said, "Just a minute, I'll be right back." And he went back into the back room, and he was in there for quite a while. After a while, he came back, and by the nation, he was carrying that very same horse blanket. He laid it down on the counter and he said, now, mister, you can see this is a much thicker blanket and it's going to do a much better job at keeping your horse warm. It's $117.95. And the man said, $117.95? $117.95? Do you know what rides in an $85,000 horse trailer? John said, a horse? A genuine Champagne 5-gated Tennessee walking mare. That's what rides in a $95,000 horse trailer. Do you really think I'm going to buy any little cheap, sleazy, $117.95 horse blanket to go on my genuine Champagne 5-gated Tennessee walking mare rides in an $85,000 horse trailer? John said, I see I have made a mistake. I used to buy real good horse blankets and keep them here, but the people around here couldn't afford to buy them. I might have one of those expensive ones left. And he picked up that horse blanket and walked back into the back room. He was in there quite some time, and we could hear him back there pushing around barrels and boxes like he was really hunting for something. But when he came through the doorway, by the nation, he was carrying that very same horse blanket. And he laid it down on the counter and he said, now this one, this is the best blanket I ever had for sale in this store, and it's only $365.17. And the man said, $365.17, huh? Yes. That man paid John, picked up that horse blanket, and walked out the door just smiling. He got in his truck and he went away. All of us sitting around the stove, we looked at one another. We looked at John. We looked at one another. And we looked at John. We were curious to know if he could find a verse in the Bible that would apply to what had just happened. You should never underestimate one of those old country storekeepers. He looked us straight in the eye and he said, he was a stranger, and I took him in. Doc McConnell and Chuck Larkin at their very, very best. God bless every one of them. My vision is that they are both in heaven playing extraordinarily intricate tricks on the angels who keep falling for them every time. So that's a story for every teller that we've lost over the years that's passed beyond our ability to hear them anymore. Yeah. I've been hanging out with you guys for a long, long time. I know some of these people longer than I know some of the people in my family. Especially the little ones. Well, I had a grandchild to raise when I didn't expect it. And I sent him to a community Montessori school. You know, Montessori schools can be kind of prohibitive financially, but this one was on a sliding scale fee. And as a storyteller, I needed it to slide a long, long way. The woman who founded this extraordinary school was someone I really admired. And one day at a parent meeting, she said to me, "You see that woman right over there?" I said, "Yes," thinking I knew which person she was pointing to. She said, "She could use a friend. You want to do something for me?" I said, "I'd do anything for you." She said, "I want you to make friends with that woman. She could use a friend, especially a steady friend like you." I'd never had anybody call me steady before. I've usually thought of the one that's somewhere out there where the buses don't run. But I thought I would do my best. I squared my shoulders and I walked over to her and I extended my hand. I said, "I'm Elizabeth." She said, "I'm Gail." I said, "How are you doing?" She said, "I'm doing pretty well. I'm not too uncomfortable here." I said, "Well, I hope you're not uncomfortable at all." She said, "Well, you know, I'm the only black face in this entire room, but I've kind of gotten used to that over the years." I said, "Well, we're awful glad to have you, and I hope that your children are going to enjoy going to school here." She said, "I think this school is just wonderful." And on the basis of the fact that our children both went to the same school, and that we both thought that school was wonderful, we became friends. And we began to plan things so our kids could get together. And one day I said, "I think it would just be wonderful if we took a trip to the zoo." She said, "I think my kids would like that. They've never been to the zoo." Well, we've been to the zoo a whole lot of times, but I didn't say anything about that. I told her when I was going to come and pick her up on Saturday morning. So me and my grandson and she and her two children, we're going to make this big trip to the zoo. When I got to her house, she wasn't ready to go. She was ironing. And I couldn't imagine why. I had told her very specifically what time I was going to come and pick her up, but she had her ironing board up. Now, my children say that their memory of their childhood is that the ironing board was always up at our house, but she never once saw anybody iron at it. That it was the place Mama's puppet heads were put to dry. That was the purpose of the ironing board. This woman was really laying to a t-shirt, ironing it, folding it very neatly, handed it to her son, and then she got out a pair of blue jeans and put them on the ironing board. And I said, "You know, the reason I came over here so early and planned for us to leave so early is because we want to get to the zoo before it gets so hot outside." I thought maybe she hadn't thought about that part. And she kept on ironing. She said, "Well, I'll be through in just a minute." I was getting a little more impatient. And I said, "You know, you really don't have to iron a pair of blue jeans. Are those for your son Richmond?" She said, "Well, yes." I said, "Well, why don't you just put them on him and let's go? It's getting late and it's getting hot out there." And she turned to me and she looked me full in the face and she said, "My child has to leave here looking twice as good as your child in order to be treated half as well." And I could hear the truth of that statement in every cell in my body. My child has to leave this house looking twice as good as your child to be treated half as well. In Dallas, Texas, that was as true as God's spit. And I imagine it was true in a lot of other places in America. She flipped those jeans over. She had spray starch. I hadn't seen spray starch in more than 100 years. She started laying on the spray starch, and when she got through, she had creases up and down the front of those pants you could cut cheese with. She said, "They may look like creases to you, but to anybody, any adult in authority who sees my child outside today, the creases in the front of those pants say, 'Back off, Jack. Somebody cares about this one.'" I had never thought of clothing as a way of communicating to the world how you expected your child to be treated. I learned a whole lot that day. Learned a whole lot from being close friends with that family. I grew up in East Tennessee. I never met a black person face to face till I was in high school. It was an education, an absolute education. As the years went by, the things we did together were different. There was not trips to the zoo anymore. Mostly we went to classical music concerts together because her son Richmond had these really big hands And a lot of mothers might have put a football or a basketball in that hand. She put a violin in her son's hand. Not at first because she thought he had any particular skill with music, but because she thought there was a lot less competition for a young black man with a violin than there would be if he was involved in sports. I could see the sense in that. Later, because his hands were so large, the violin was changed out for a viola. Even fewer viola players, less competition. And Richmond rose to the challenge and learned to play until he was playing absolutely beautifully. Elegantly. Now, one time he called me up on the phone and he said, I have this thing I have to do for school. It's an assignment and it's impossible. My mom said I should call you. You might have some ideas about it. I said, what's the assignment? He said, the teacher says that I have to interview somebody who was active in the civil rights movement. I said, and why can't you do that? He said, well, you know they're all dead. I said, is your grandpa at home? He said, well, yes. Where would my grandpa be going? His grandpa had been going deeper and deeper into dementia. Gail was committed to taking care of her father and never farming him out to be taken care of by strangers. I said, your grandfather was very active in the civil rights movement in this area. Why don't you try to interview your grandfather? And he tried, but Mr. Punch couldn't follow the train of thought. He had slipped beyond the place where an interview was really possible. And so Richmond called me back up and he said, do you know anybody else that was active in the civil rights movement that I can interview? And I played my trump card. I said, well, what if I could guide you to someone who was on the National Mall when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech? And he said, that would be perfect. Where would I find a person like that still alive? I said, I'll be home at 3 o'clock. Because I was still capable of giving an interview that was appropriate for turning in for a class assignment. Time went by. Richmond got better and better at that violin, better and better at the viola, special teachers being hired to give him a foot up, a leg up, a boost up. Put your foot right here and I'll give you all the help I can. But his mom called me one day and said that she was ill. I hadn't seen her in about a week, and that was unusual. I figured she had the flu. So later in the day, I went over to visit to see if there was something I could do to be of help. I rang the doorbell, and I expected when the door opened that I would be enveloped by the familiar smell of furniture polish and some kind of patchouli or other sort of thing that you would put out to make the room smell good. Potpourri, that's the word I was searching for. And instead, when the door opened, the smell was the smell of a house where only children had been cleaning for a while. And not very well. When I walked into the house, I went back to the bedroom to see my friend. She was in bed. I talked to her for a little while, and the hair rose on the back of my neck because I realized the illness was much more serious than I had imagined. We were not talking about somebody who had the flu. This was a serious illness. And I set to do what things needed to be done. I walked into the kitchen. It was a disaster area. And I turned to Richmond and to his sister Lauren and said, why did you let all those dishes stack up like that? You all know how to wash dishes. And Richmond said, because the sink won't drain. We can't wash dishes because the sink won't drain. And the washing machine, it's not draining either. Some kind of a plumbing problem. The washing machine and the sink both don't drain. My stacks and stacks of dirty clothes in a house that was always immaculate, and all that mess on the kitchen counter, dirty pots and pans every place you looked. I started to suggest you could go outside and run a tub of water outside, maybe begin to wash some of these dishes outside. But something stopped me, and I thought I might go in a different direction. I said, what we need is a plumber. Richmond said, plumbers cost a lot of money. Well, I knew that. I thought, how can I get a plumber? The first call I made was to the Black Chamber of Commerce. When the lady answered the phone, I said, this may sound like a strange request, but I'm asking you to give me the name and telephone number of a man who belongs to the Black Chamber of Commerce who has made a fortune in the plumbing business. She said, why do you want to know that? I said, my friend is ill and she has a plumbing problem. Could you help me? There are children involved. And she gave me the name of a man that she said had made more money than God's eye teeth in the plumbing business because I said the name children. She gave me a telephone number, and I dialed it right away. And I knew if I could get to talk to that man, I could convince him to help me with this. When the phone was answered, it was a woman's voice. And I thought, of course there's a gatekeeper. Why you didn't think of that? There's a gatekeeper, of course. He's an important, busy man. There's probably more than one gatekeeper. This one's going to decide whether or not you get to talk to the next gatekeeper. And I was trying to think of something I could say, anything I could say that would make her pass me on, not just to the second gatekeeper, but to the big man himself. I said, I would really, really like to speak to Mr. Burns. And she said, and what is this concerning? And I said the first thing that popped into my head. I said, this matter is confidential. He came to that phone like he'd been shot through a cannon. The first thing he said was, who is this? I said, please don't hang up on me. Please, just listen for a minute. As you can probably tell by the sound of my voice, I'm not black. But my friend is, my good friend is, and she is very, very ill. And I'm helping her family and her children. But we've got a plumbing problem. The sink won't drain and the washing machine won't drain. They're standing with water in both of them. If I could get somebody to fix this plumbing, I could make things work here. Could you help me with that? And he said, I'm a very, very busy man. I said, I understand that you are, sir. But remember, my friend has children. I'm asking you to get this fixed for your mother. He said, for my mother. I said, I'm asking you to honor your mother by fixing my friend's plumbing. He said, I'll be there at 4 o'clock. When the black Lincoln Continental pulled up in front of their house, nobody in the neighborhood stayed inside. They all came out to stare at that car. They hadn't seen anything like that in the neighborhood in a long, long time. He got out and walked around. Now, I don't own Armani, but I do know it when I see it. He took off his suit coat and he laid it on the back seat of the Lincoln Continental. And he came around to the trunk and he opened it. I watched as he popped his cufflinks out of his shirt sleeves and dropped them into his trouser pocket. And then he reached into the trunk and he pulled out a pair of coveralls, dark blue coveralls with a little white stripe in them. Standing there at the back of that Lincoln Continental, he put them on, zipped them up the front, and picked up the toolkit out of the back of that car and walked up to the door. And I thought, this man has not been on a plumbing call himself, probably in more than 15 or 20 years. But I met him at the door, and I made him welcome. And I explained to him that my friend didn't want to be seen that day because she was so sick at her stomach. And he said that was all right. He had just come to fix the plumbing. All the time he's working on it, Richmond is in his room practicing for a Mozart competition. And the sound of it is so beautiful that it hurts your heart to think that he might stop playing. And Mr. Punch is wandering through the kitchen, talking to himself under his breath, in tune to the Mozart concerto that's coming from the bedroom. And he says, I'm going to have to go outside and work on the plumbing from underneath the house. And I thought, that man's going to crawl underneath the house? I bet he hasn't done that in, I bet God doesn't remember the last time he did that. He was outside for about a half hour. And by the time he came in, water was running down the drain. And I turned the tap on and started sprinkling Comet on the sink and started cleaning things up, thinking about washing all those dishes, getting the kids together to get all that done. So he comes in. He looks around to check on his work and make sure that everything's working fine. He says, run a whole load of nothing in the washing machine. We don't know if any water's going to come, ugly water's going to come back from the bottom. So I wouldn't have thought to do that. I was so eager to get rid of those piles of dirty clothes, I would put them in the machine right away. So I was grateful to him that he'd given me that tip. He said, your friend's really sick, isn't she? I said, my friend's dying, but it's going to take a long time. He said, if they ever need anything else, you call me. I said, all right. A couple of years went by. Richmond entering another Mozart competition. His teacher said that she'd really like him to do it, and he was reluctant because he knew that money was really, really tight. There were the entry fees to be paid. I said, what else needs to be covered? He said, well, I have to buy the music. I thought, well, that can't be too expensive. I said, you tell your music teacher to order the music and I'll write her a check. So he told her. I didn't understand what I was saying. It was not the first time I had that experience with this family. I know a whole lot about the Grand Ole Opry and nothing about the Metropolitan Opera. What I know about classical music wouldn't even fill up a thimble. How did I know that what she was ordering were presentation packages of the music in leather bindings, a set for Richmond, and of course there had to be a set for the pianist who would accompany him, and the pianist would need to be paid for her time. That made perfect sense, but the check I had to write to cover that, my hand kind of began to cramp because I could have bought a plane ticket to somewhere real nice with that kind of money. Lauren was getting ready to graduate from the 8th grade, and I was real pleased for her, and I said, tell me what you need for 8th grade graduation. Turns out in the black community in Dallas, 8th grade graduation is a really big deal. She presented me with the paper from her backpack about what she was supposed to wear and what she needed to give to the event. So she needs to wear a solid white dress and white tights, and white shoes, all of them with no additional decoration on them if possible, so that all of the graduates looked just alike. And I made some silly joke about how the boys were going to look really silly in those white dresses. And like most teenagers, she just rolled her eyes. Each family was asked to give an $80 donation for the musicians and the food and the other things that would accompany the graduation. I can cover that. And then I said to her, you know, a couple of years ago, you had your hair braided, and you looked so cute with your hair braided. Would you like to have your hair braided for graduation? And she said, oh, I really would. I said, how do we do that? She said, well, my mother calls Mrs. Stevens on the phone and tells her that I'm going to come on Saturday. And she takes me over to Mrs. Stevens' house, and I watch cartoons all morning while she braids my hair. It takes about 3 hours. Oh. I said, and can I write a check to Miss Stevens? She said, I think Miss Stevens only takes cash. And she was right about that part. I discovered that having her hair braided was going to cost another $100. The white dress and the white tights and the white shoes, we managed to get fairly economically. But the $100 for the hair braiding, I had to come up with because it had been my big bright idea. Sometimes my mouth gets me stuck in tight places. I had already taken to Richmond to 3 colleges on college visits. 2 historically black college and 1 state school. I had actually taken money out of my savings to pay for those trips. They had all been made in my car to places in Texas. But I have to tell you, in case you've forgotten, Texas is a very big state. So I drove a lot of miles, and I was scraping the barrel to get the flour off the bottom, as my mama used to say, financially. When we got the letter that was out of step with all the other colleges, it turns out Juilliard has its own timetable that doesn't match any other school. And the letter inviting Richmond to come to Juilliard to audition arrived after I'd spent a lot of money and begun to put things on my credit card. And I couldn't think of any way I was going to be able to manage that. And all of a sudden, I remembered what the very wealthy man who owned the plumbing business had said, if they need anything, call me. I thought, I hope he still remembers us. And so when the gatekeeper answered the telephone, I said, please tell Mr. Burns that Elizabeth Ellis, the storyteller, would like to speak with him. And he came right to the phone. And he said, Mrs. Ellis, what do you need? And I said, I would appreciate it if you'd be calling me Elizabeth. Mrs. Ellis is my mama. She's a nice lady. She lives up in Kentucky. I'm Elizabeth. I don't even try to be Mrs. Ellis. He said, well, I have enough respect to you for you not to want to call you by your first name. I said, I wish that you would call me by my first name so that we could be friends. And he said, in that case, Elizabeth, how can I help you? I said, well, Richmond did so well in the Mozart competition this year. He has the chance. I'm looking at a letter, an invitation to come to Juilliard in New York City to audition. And sir, I am tapped out. We have visited 3 colleges. We Graduated Lauren from the 8th grade. I am completely tapped out. I don't know if you know this or not, but being a storyteller doesn't bring in as much money as owning a plumbing business. He kind of chuckled just like you all did. I said, "You want to hear a good joke?" He said, "Well, yeah." I said, "Did you hear about the storyteller that won the lottery?" He said, "No, I didn't hear about that." They asked him what he was going to do with all that money. He said, "I guess I'll just keep telling until it runs out." He didn't understand why that was funny. I was laughing my head off. I said, "I need the money for a ticket to New York City." He said, "Just a ticket for Richmond? Nobody going with him?" I said, "No, we can't afford that. We just need a ticket to get Richmond to New York City so he can go to this audition." He said, "Well, he's going to need some money when he gets there. Does he have decent clothes to wear?" I said, "Well, yeah, he can look presentable." He said, "He needs to look sharp." So that man came over and picked Richmond up and took him shopping for clothes to wear to New York City and gave me $300 when that would easily buy you a ticket back and forth to New York in those days. And I thought we were set. At the 11th hour, my very ill friend said, "Richmond can't go to New York City alone. He's only 17 years old." I said, "Richmond's got good sense. He'll do what we tell him to do. He's going to stay in a hotel room." No, my son's not going to stay in a hotel room in New York City all by himself. He can't possibly do that. That's impossible. No, it's impossible. It's impossible. And she starts to cry. Well, she beat me to it only by a minute or two. I felt like after everything I had done, if she was going to tell me that I couldn't send Richmond to New York because there was nobody to go with him, I might never be able to walk and talk again in my life. I'd go into some sort of catatonic state over it and never be heard tell of again. But you know, there's this little thing that dwells right down inside you. I don't know if your cardiologist had ever told you about it. It dwells between the chambers of your heart. It's called hope. I said, if I could find a family that was willing to let Richmond stay with them while he was in New York, would you tell me that you would let him go? And my friend said, "How on earth are you going to do a thing like that?" And I said, "I am a person who knows people." That was only partly true. I didn't really know anybody that lived in New York City. But I had once told stories with a very well-known Jewish storyteller who lived in New York City. I called the National Storytelling Office and asked for her telephone number, and they gave it to me. I called her on the phone and I said, "Panina, this is Elizabeth Ellis calling you from Texas. You don't know me very well." And she said, "I know that because you're mispronouncing my name." And I said, "That means we're off to a bad start. I'm really sorry about that because I was going to ask you for a big favor." And she said, "My name's Panina," and ask away. I said, "I'm trying to help this child. He is 17, getting ready to have his 18th birthday any minute now. And he has this golden opportunity. I need somebody that will let him stay at their house in New York City because his mother, who is sick, I mean really sick, is throwing a cat fit at me at the 11th hour because I was going to send him to New York City and let him stay in a hotel room by himself overnight. And she said, I don't know that I would want one of my children to stay in a hotel room in New York City overnight, and I live here. I said, could he come to your house and stay? I'll give him money so that he can get a cab to your house. And she said, you tell that child's mother I will pick him up at the airport. I said, would you do that for a child you don't know? She said, do you know what my brother does for a living? I said, no, I have no idea. She said, he's a very well-known classical music conductor. I understand what an opportunity this is for this young man, that he would get to audition for Juilliard. I would do anything for a child to help them do that. It wouldn't matter whether I knew them or their families or not. She honored her word, and so did my friend. Instead of backing out at the last minute, which I was always afraid she was going to do, she let Richmond go because somebody was going to meet him at the airport and take him to their house and feed him and let him spend the night. Panini went to his audition with him. People there recognized her on sight because of who her brother was. And when Richmond was offered the full ride scholarship to go to Juilliard, you could have heard the cheering all over the neighborhood. All over the neighborhood. People who didn't know him, people who'd never seen him before, the people who had teased him and made fun of him because he didn't play football or basketball, all had an incredible block party, fish fry. I ate catfish tonight. One of the reasons why I thought about telling this story. The men in the neighborhood cooked catfish and the women made potato salad, and we sold plate after plate after plate after plate to people. All over the area people came. Richmond ended up with spending money for a whole semester of what we earned from that catfish fry. One of the people who came and brought all the people from his office was the man who had made it possible for Richmond to fly all the way to New York City on the airplane, Mr. Burns. And as for Lauren went to a college in South Carolina, played in their orchestra, enjoyed her time there, met the love of her life, married him in a white dress with white shoes. I don't think she wore white tights, though. She never lifted that long skirt for me to be able to see what was underneath it. I provided the something old by being there, she said. And Richmond walked her down the aisle and gave her away. And then played special music for the event and played at the reception with 3 or 4 of his friends. It was beautiful. My friend lived long enough to see her children grow up and go out into the world and begin their own lives, and then passed quietly and gently, the way I hoped she would. I miss her. She was the first person I ever knew who died of AIDS. If she contracted that disease now, we have developed medication that would save her life. But at the time, nobody really understood much about how it worked. Nobody really knew what to do. And everyone was afraid of it because they didn't know how you contracted it. People make a lot of stereotypical ideas. They make judgments about things they know very little about. I've been guilty of that all my life. But spending time with that family helped me learn that things are not always the way they seem. That people, no matter what color their skin is, live pretty much the same kinds of lives. It's just that life is harder for some people because of the color of their skin than it is for some of the rest of us. I think I want to close with a poem from Carl Sandburg. And before the poem, a quote. Remember, this is Carl Sandburg speaking, okay? At age 21, I went to West Point, being a classmate of General Douglas MacArthur and Ulysses S. Grant III for 3 weeks. Being a success in science and mathematics, being sent home a failure in grammar. A failure in grammar. Let a joy keep you. Reach out with your hand and grab it as it runs by, as I have seen the Apache dancer clutch his woman. For I have seen them live long and laugh loud, sent on singing, singing, crushed to the heart under the ribs with a terrible love. Joy always, joy everywhere. Let joy keep you. Keep away from little deaths. Thank you.